What Annie Farmer just revealed isn't just a story. It's a warning siren for anyone who still believes the justice system protects the vulnerable. Because once you hear how many times she was asked to trust authorities, how many times she was promised accountability, and how many times those promises collapsed into silence, you start to realize the truth. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly the way it was built, to shield the powerful, not the survivors. And when Annie stepped forward again this week, she didn't just expose her own pain.
Farmer joins me now. Annie, I'm grateful for your time. It's been a long journey. Tell me how you're feeling about today and what you hope will come of today's advocacy.
Well, thank you for having me, Major, and thank you for centering the voices of survivors. That's something that has not happened enough in this case. I'm feeling a little exhausted after today, but also hopeful. You know, this last couple of days has been very powerful, both to be gathered with so many other women that are sharing their stories and are bravely speaking out and asking for justice, but also to be finally invited into the conversation. And I think, to meet with lawmakers, to see them be emotionally moved by these stories, it felt like perhaps for the first time that maybe there was a chance that there would be movement.
The president was asked about this today, and he again called this a Democratic hoax. How did that make you feel?
It's very troubling to hear that language used. And I think that actually came up at the press conference. And to be in the company of so many women who had just told their stories, and then to have him continue to say this, it felt like it feels like an assault on us again, right? There's been so many betrayals over the years in this case by the government, and to be there on the steps, to be invited by lawmakers, to be telling our stories, and then to have the president say it's a hoax, it's very upsetting.
Walk my audience through what you mean, Annie, when you talk about government betrayals so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to 1996. You know, that's when I met Epstein and Maxwell. And that's when my sister, Maria Farmer, first reported what happened to me when I went to Zor Ranch, and what happened to her when she was assaulted on the Wexner property, and the theft of photographs that she had taken for her art that were sensitive photographs of herself and of me and my younger sister. So she reported that to the FBI. There was, as far as we know, no further investigation. There was no follow-up, at least with us. And then in 2006, we're approached by the FBI, and they say, okay, now we really need you to tell your stories. We need you to come forward. We know this is scary, but we're going to make sure that this man is finally held accountable. And then, as we all know, he gets a sweetheart deal. We're not even informed of what has happened with the case. We're left hanging. And, he's given a chance to leave his imprisonment during the day on a work release program, where we heard stories yesterday about how he continued the abuse during that work release program. Right. So, that's another betrayal. And then I'd say in 2019, he's finally arrested. Once again, we feel hopeful, and he dies in U.S. custody. And then we're asked to come forward and share again our stories with the FBI, and that there may be further people arrested. And the only person from all of that, from all the stories that were told, that was arrested was Ghislaine Maxwell. I was one of the women who was a witness at her trial, one of the 4 victims, and we represented so many others. And in that case, we went again, agreed that we would do this, to testify and go through this process for the government, and then to see what's happened recently with her prison transfer and talk of a pardon. I mean, it's a real slap in the face.
Do you want the files in the possession of the Justice Department and the Treasury Department released in hopes that they might lead to further prosecution, or just so that everyone can see what happened, and whether there's prosecution or not, you and other survivors obtain some measure of probably inadequate, but nevertheless important closure?
I think transparency, hopefully there could be many outcomes, right? One, I do believe is understanding the systemic failures that allowed this abuse to continue for so long. That's important for our country to keep children safe, is for us to understand what went wrong here. But also, I do believe there are people in positions of power that were very much implicated that have never been held accountable, and that the pressure could come from the public if they know what is in that information, that something might be done.
She exposed a pattern of betrayal stretching across decades that should make every one of us stop and ask, how deep does this go? For the first time in years, she spoke openly about the earliest moments of this nightmare. The moment back in the late 90s when she and her sister first reported what happened. Sensitive photographs stolen, a violent encounter ignored, evidence mishandled or dismissed. All of it delivered directly to the people who were supposed to protect them. And what happened next? Nothing. No follow-up. No protection. No sign that anyone in authority felt urgency, concern, or even basic responsibility. Survivors weren't just overlooked, they were erased. But as Annie would learn, that was only the beginning. Years later, federal agents approached her again. This time, they said, things would be different. This time, they needed her story. They emphasized courage, promised accountability, and told her and her sister that their voices would finally matter. So she did something incredibly difficult. She reopened the wounds, shared the details, relived the pain, and placed her trust in people who insisted they were finally ready to act. And yet, the outcome was one of the most infamous sweetheart deals in American history. A deal not only hidden from the survivors, but designed to give a wealthy, well-connected predator privileges most incarcerated people could never dream of. He wasn't behind bars in any meaningful way. He was free to leave during the day under the guise of work release. And reports later surfaced suggesting that even during this supposed punishment, his behavior didn't stop. For the survivors who had risked so much to step forward, it was another crushing reminder that justice in this country is often determined by power, money, and proximity to influence, not truth. It wasn't just a failure. It was betrayal layered on betrayal. And then came 2019, the year many survivors finally allowed themselves to feel hope again. The arrest felt different this time. It felt like the system might be waking up. Annie and others stepped forward once more, telling their stories for a second time, believing that this time investigators would follow the evidence everywhere it led. They believed wider accountability was finally within reach. They believed the network behind the abuse, those who enabled it, funded it, protected it, would finally face the consequences. But before that could happen, the man at the center of it all was found dead in federal custody under circumstances that remain one of the most debated and suspicious moments of the last decade. For survivors, it was devastating. Not because justice required him to be alive, but because with him gone, the system instantly had an excuse to stop asking questions. And even though they spoke again with investigators, even though they expressed willingness to testify again, even though new details emerged, the only person ultimately prosecuted out of the entire network was his longtime associate. That trial was supposed to expose the broader system of enablers. Instead, it narrowed everything down to one convenient person. Annie was one of only 4 women chosen to testify, representing the experiences of dozens more whose stories never saw a courtroom. She did everything the government asked of her, again. She faced cross-examination, again. She relived the trauma, again. All for what? So the system could congratulate itself for a single conviction while leaving a long list of implicated figures untouched. And just when survivors thought the last sliver of accountability had finally landed in the right place, even that began to slip away. She watched as the woman at the center of the conviction was quietly transferred to a lower security facility. Rumors began circulating online about the possibility of clemency someday. Rumors that survivors could not ignore because of how many times they had already been blindsided. To Annie, it felt like the same pattern repeating again. Minimize consequences for those with connections, while survivors continue fighting for recognition. But even after all of this, decades of pain, silence, and institutional failure, the moment that hit Annie the hardest wasn't from the courts. It wasn't from an investigator. It wasn't even from the government agencies holding thousands of pages of sealed records. It was from the public stage, when a political figure dismissed the entire matter as nothing more than a partisan hoax. After everything survivors endured, after everything they risked by coming forward, after years of begging for accountability and transparency, hearing their trauma reduced to a talking point felt like a fresh assault. Imagine standing on the steps of Congress, surrounded by women who have spent years fighting to be heard, and hearing their experiences dismissed in front of the entire country. Annie described that moment as deeply troubling, not because she is surprised anymore, but because she knows exactly how dangerous dismissive language can be. When people in powerful positions suggest this case is fake or exaggerated, they aren't just denying survivors' stories. They are giving cover to anyone who benefits from keeping the truth buried. They are signaling that protecting reputations matters more than protecting children. And this is where Annie's message becomes bigger than her personal story. She is calling for the release of the files, not for revenge, not for politics, but because she understands how many failures allowed this abuse to continue for so long. The documents held by federal agencies contain names, financial trails, communications, and evidence that could reveal the full scope of the network that enabled him. Survivors believe that if the public could see these records, the pressure for accountability would become impossible to ignore. Because even if prosecutors hesitate, even if institutions want to move on, the public would not. This isn't just about one person. It's about examining why government agencies failed repeatedly. It's about exposing how certain individuals were shielded. It's about confronting the reality that some people live by a completely different set of rules. And it's about preventing the next version of this case. Because if the same systems remain untouched, the same outcomes will follow. But perhaps the most important part of Annie's message is what she expects from the rest of us. Survivors have already done everything they can. They came forward. They testified. They reopened wounds that many of us could never fully understand. They stood in front of cameras, lawmakers, and courtroom after courtroom because they believed transparency could finally lead to safety for themselves, for other victims, and for future generations. Now the question is whether the public will step up. Because if we stay silent, the story ends the way so many others have ended, with survivors carrying the weight alone while those who should have been held accountable slip quietly into the background. If the files stay sealed, if the truth stays hidden, if the pressure fades, nothing changes. The system remains exactly what it has been, a shield for those with power and a maze of dead ends for those seeking justice. But if people refuse to let this story be buried, if they demand transparency, if they amplify survivors' voices instead of dismissing them, then the truth becomes impossible to hide. That's what Annie is fighting for. Not sympathy, not attention, but a country willing to face uncomfortable truths. A country willing to finally ask, who was protected? Who helped hide the abuse? And why have so many been able to walk away untouched? Survivors have already given everything. It's on us now to ensure their fight wasn't for nothing. If you believe accountability matters, if you believe transparency matters, if you believe survivors deserve more than decades of betrayal, then don't look away. And if you want to stay updated on every moment of this unfolding story, make sure you subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The truth doesn't surface on its own. People bring it to light. Let's be those people.